Do you remember those times when you were just beginning something new and you didn't quite know how or where to begin? Maybe you just took a new job or just got married. Maybe you started a new school or you moved to a new city. It can be difficult to begin, and it's so good to have someone to walk alongside of you. Hi, my name is Bob Chisholm, and this is the beginning of a new class series we're entitled Rhythms of the Inner Life. And as we begin this class series, I want us to think about the whole idea of beginning, because God knows where we're going. And I'm so grateful that God begins where we are. I mean, after all, He doesn't have a choice. It's similar to when new parents are using those simple, repetitive words to try to teach their children how to speak. God uses our language because we don't know His language. In fact, it would be difficult to even imagine the language of the Creator of the universe, the inexhaustible vocabulary of God, the infallible linguistics of God, the immeasurable language of God. In fact, it is this powerful language of God, the Word of God, that spoke the universe into existence. So yes, I'm grateful that He didn't require us to go to where He is, but instead He came to where we are. In fact, this is really the point of the incarnation. God becoming a human being, becoming one of us, coming to where we are. Philippians 2 puts it this way: Jesus Christ, who though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied Himself, taking the form of a servant and being born in the likeness of men, moving from the form of God to the likeness of men. Or Hebrews 2 mentions it also. Since the children have flesh and blood, He too shared in their humanity. He had to be made like them, fully human in every way. Because He Himself suffered when He was tempted, He's able to help those who are being tempted. And so, being born in human likeness, fully human in every way, and then perhaps the clearest scripture of all, very short and simple, John 1, the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. I am so thankful that God begins where we are. I'm grateful that He took steps to join us. I'm thankful that He wants to walk alongside of us. However, I have to say, for some of us, our schedules are so tight and our lives are so filled up, it would be difficult for God to even get in. Many have not learned to give God the space to act in their lives. Instead, they go through their life with no boundaries and no borders. And I'm not talking about just the busy life. I'm talking about the overextended life. You see, when someone completely fills their day, when they completely schedule their life, they are essentially saying to God, I don't really expect you to do anything that I have not already thought of. And therein lies the problem. They're not expecting God to do anything. They're not looking for anything more. They're not looking for anything outside their own mind. They leave no space for God. As Randy Harris has wisely written, if you are overextended, you are undercommitted. Now, I suppose I could argue with myself and say, well, how could I be undercommitted if I've given myself to so many good things? Isn't that the definition of commitment? Well, that's exactly the problem. It's because I've given myself to so many things that I can't give much of myself to any one of them. I'm overextended and therefore undercommitted. Wayne Mueller is a therapist who works with people who are suffering through serious illnesses. And he writes about this unusual mixture of two really seems like opposing ideas, and he finds them together: sadness at being sick and relief. And he finds them together. And when illness interrupts an overly busy life, that's where he finds them. In fact, in his book entitled Sabbath, he explains that while everybody has their own particular fear and sorrow, he writes that almost everyone confesses some secret gratefulness. Finally, they say, at last, I can rest. And his conclusion, if we do not allow for a rhythm of rest in our overly busy life, illness becomes our Sabbath. If we don't stop our relentless round of constant activity, if we don't learn to pause, to stop, to rest, then he's saying our physical bodies will revolt and we will get sick, and there will be an enforced Sabbath. Often at conferences and retreats, when I'm trying to describe how important it is to intentionally create unclaimed time, time that is left deliberately open, space that I can give to God. To illustrate that, I will often ask for a volunteer from the audience, the group of people gathered. And I ask them to help me in this way. I tell them that I'm going to put on the screen just two paragraphs, 135 words. And all that I want them to do is to begin to read out loud what they see on the screen as soon as it appears. Simple enough? And then I put this up on the screen. Try reading this short article without any punctuation. Even though it's short, it's hard to read and doesn't make much sense, does it? Without punctuation markings and the space between words, we lose the sense of the words. Direction is lacking. The words pile up upon one another with no meaning. Periods, commas, and simple space are what give words their power and their purpose. In the same way, silence, solitude, and reflection are the punctuation marks in the routine of our lives. The commas, the pauses, the full stops scattered throughout our days can bring power and purpose to what we do and what we say, especially if we are quiet long enough to rediscover spiritual power. Without the disciplines of spiritual formation, life becomes a blur of activity, devoid of depth and meaning. Now, as you can imagine, it's a bit surprising to the volunteer when this pops up on the screen, and they often will hesitate before they begin their slow, halting, laborious reading. Usually at some point I will interrupt them and ask if someone else would like to finish the reading, and then when we're finished struggling through it, we'll talk about what has just happened. Why was this so difficult to read? Why was it difficult to even get started? Now, of course, there is an actual message embedded in the 135 words, but there's also a message, in fact, it's the same message, that's in the structure present on the screen. It's what is not there. What is not on the screen? Space. It's been taken out. This is what makes the reading so difficult. And so I put up a second slide. Now, what's changed? No new words have been added. No additional content has been provided. The only thing that's been added is some space and a little punctuation. You see, empty space around each word is a boundary, it's a border, it's a buffer zone. It protects the word, allowing that word to be fully seen and appreciated. And without this space, as we saw, the words crowd into each other, and letters from one word are stolen by the words around it. And frustration, confusion, misunderstanding, and the whole message is now in danger. In fact, look at these phrases again. Lose the sense. Direction is lacking. Life becomes a blur. Go back to what Randy Harris said. If you are overextended, you're under-committed. So where do we begin? Where do we start? We start by creating space, unclaimed, available space, available to God. I had a dear friend and a mentor to me who was a very busy, productive man. And he knew this about himself. And so as a reminder to himself, he had a framed little saying, and it was on the wall right above his workstation so he could see it every day. And it said this: "Good morning, this is God. Today I'll be handling all of your problems. I won't be needing your help. Have a nice day." You see, he needed to see this every day. He needed to rehearse the truth of this every day, because he knew, and we all know, that the culture around us is giving us a different message, a counter message. C.S. Lewis described this counter message in his book, Mere Christianity. He said, "The moment you wake up each morning, all your wishes and hopes for the day rush at you like wild animals. And the first job each morning consists in simply shoving it all back, in listening to that other voice, taking that other point of view, letting that other larger, stronger, quieter life come flowing in." And can you see the rushed, wild messages of our world? And then God's counter message, that larger, stronger, quieter. God's message is there, but we have to know it's contending with, it's fighting with the currents of the world. And this conflict reminds me of a spiritual formation conference that I attended some years ago in Santa Barbara, California. At that gathering, I heard John Ortberg retell a story that he had written about in his book, The Life You've Always Wanted. In the book, he wrote that shortly after moving to Chicago, he called what he called a wise friend to ask for some spiritual direction. He described the pace to his friend at which his life was moving. He told him about the rhythms of his family life, and he told him about the spiritual condition of his own heart. And then he asked his friend, "What do I need to do to be spiritually healthy?" He said there was a long pause on the phone, and this friend finally said, "You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life." And then the phone got quiet again. And Ortberg said, "Okay, I've written that one down. That's a good one. Now, what else is there?" And he explained to the gathered group at our conference, he said, "This was a long distance call, and I had a lot to do. And so I wanted to cram as many units of spiritual wisdom as I could into the least amount of time possible." And so we continued to wait. And after a long pause, his friend finally said, "There is nothing else. You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life." And as Ortberg retold that story at the conference that day, he told us that Dallas Willard, who was also there speaking, was that wise friend who told him to be ruthless. And I thought, what was it that Dallas Willard knew that he wanted to pass on to his young friend? Why do older men and women today who are further down the spiritual pathway, why do they consistently tell younger men and women to slow down? And why do most of the loud messages of our current culture tell us to hurry? Well, consider this evidence that I found. In 2016, eBay did a study of what they called the most impatient cities in the United States. They wanted to know who would pay the most for speed and convenience. And it wasn't simply an opinion poll. They actually measured trends that have sprung up to meet the needs of busy people. And it won't surprise you that they found impatience as a way of life. I mean, everything from food to photos to dating to driving, it's all done more quickly. Less and less of life is savored. Less is lingered over. And so, to use the words of the study, the ansiest city in the nation was Austin. Houston was third, and Dallas was fifth. And when you put all the cities together, Texas was the ansiest state in the Union. And by the way, The title of the article I read in the Austin Business Journal was, "Hurry up and read this story." That's the problem. That's the depth of the problem. How very different was an experience I had with a mentor and a friend, Terry Smith, who was a campus minister before me. He had been the campus minister at Memphis State University, and I was the new incoming campus minister at Memphis State University. And so I had some time with him, and I asked him the very first question that came into my mind. What's the secret to a successful campus ministry? Of course, I had my own ideas, but I knew that Terry would probably have some tips and techniques that would help me along the way. Now, I have to say that now, looking back, I'm a bit ashamed that all I was after were a few new tricks to put in my bag of tips. As a longtime follower of Jesus and as a seasoned campus minister, Terry had so much more to give me, and he did. And so he began where I thought he might begin. He said, a successful campus ministry begins with a broad look at the entire school year. And I thought, well, that's wonderful. And I can only imagine the list that he was about to give me. And so I got up my pen and my pad and I was ready to write it all down. And he continued. He said, the school year is divided into 2 semesters. And I thought, this is perfect. This is even more practical than I thought it was going to be. And so I prepared myself to write down all the ministry programs that would take place in the typical semester. I thought that Terry would be giving me, classes and retreats and trips and banquets and projects and devotionals, things that I could implement and then I could polish and then I could simply repeat every semester. But Terry narrowed his focus even more. He said the school year is really just a collection of weeks. And I thought, well, of course. I could finally see where he was going with this. Each student followed a weekly schedule of classes and activities, and for the most part, they just repeated that week after week. How practical could it be? He was going to tell me exactly how to structure a campus ministry week, or so I thought. You see, what I didn't know is that Terry was not thinking about structure at all. He was thinking about relationships and people. And at that moment, the person he was thinking about was me. And so when he tightened our discussion even more, moving from the typical campus week to an individual day, I became more uncomfortable. Especially when he concluded, he said, to answer your question directly, a successful campus ministry occurs when you begin each day by giving it to God. And then he began to talk to me about the power of daily quiet time. He was slowing me down. He was taking the hurry out of my life. Psalm 37, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Exodus 14, the Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. And Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. I like the way the Jerusalem Bible translates Psalm 46:10. It says, pause a while. And then the Message translation speaks directly to our culture by saying, step out of the traffic. I mentioned that I'm calling this class Beginning, but really there are 2 beginnings, one from God's side and the other from our side. Of course, God made the first move, creating, initiating, giving life, and then supplying and loving and foreseeing and reaching down to us. But then eventually it came over to our side. What would we do? Would we reach up to God? Would we walk with him in the cool of the day in the garden? Or would we eat the forbidden fruit and hide? You see, God made the first move. And ironically, our move is to not move. It's to stop. It's to pause. It's to rest. It's to listen. It's to break the cycle of hurry. And Jesus is the clearest picture of this. He's our teacher. And so I want to focus the rest of our time on the example of Jesus using some powerful spiritual tools to stop and to pause. Specifically, these 4 tools: time, movement, place, and purpose. Jesus used these powerful spiritual tools over and over again, and we can do the same thing. I want you to look with me at one verse that contains all 4 of the tools. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Mark chapter 1 and verse 35. Can you see the 4 tools there? Here's where I find them in this verse. Time, very early in the morning. Movement, Jesus got up and left. Place, he found that solitary place. And his purpose, it was to pray. And I'd like to look at each of these together. Time, movement, place, and purpose. 4 tools that Jesus used, 4 tools that we can use. And so let's go over them one at a time. First, let's look at time. Very early in the morning. It seemed like Jesus preferred the morning. I mean, he slipped away before anyone else was even up. Early worked for him, and I know it might not work for you. I lead spiritual journey groups in the early morning every day of the week, usually from 5:30 to 7, a different group each day. And when I invite someone to be a part of this year-long spiritual journey, inevitably someone will ask me, well, why are we meeting so early? Why at 5:30 in the morning? And there are a lot of practical reasons, but one I like to tell them is no one is interested in you at 5:30 in the morning. Not your clients, not your boss, not your neighbors, probably not even your family at 5:30 in the morning. And that time works for us because we can travel to the place we're going to gather with minimal traffic. We can spend an hour and a half together, and then we can finish before anyone is interested in us. Now, I realize you may be still shaking your head thinking, well, I am just not a morning person. And that's very understandable. If morning is not your time, well, when would be your time that you could regularly give to God? For Jesus, he was the master of time. It was not his master. And his time alone with God was vital to him. In his book, Space for God, Don Postema has written, I used to write on my daily calendar 7 to 7:30 prayer, but many times I passed that up. It was just one more thing to pass by that day. Now I write 7 to 7:30 God. Somehow that's a little harder to neglect. A second tool for Jesus was movement. Jesus got up and actually left. He had to leave the camp. He left the place where he ate and slept for probably a number of reasons. Perhaps he needed to talk to God out loud. Maybe he wanted to sing a psalm of praise to God. Maybe he simply needed to know that he was completely alone with God, to bare his heart and bare his soul. And sometimes that just requires movement. I mean, think about yourself. Maybe you need to step away from your home or your office, maybe your school, and just for a little while. Maybe you need to get away from that company of people, the activity, and feel uninhibited, where you can pray, you can sing, you can talk to God about anything that's on your heart, knowing that you are alone with God. And so take a walk, drive to a park, go sit out in your backyard. I know of a father of some very young children that you think it would be difficult for him to find that time, and here's how he did it. He walked to the doorway in the kitchen that led into the garage, and he turned and he waved to his little children goodbye, and then he shut the door. And they all thought Daddy's leaving. But what Daddy was doing was going to sit down in a lawn chair in his garage. It worked for him. Basil Pennington described the movement that we sometimes need this way. He writes, "Silence is the very presence of God, always there, but activity hides it. We need to leave activity long enough to discover the presence. Then we can return to activity with it." A third tool for Jesus was place. He found that solitary place. I think this was a regular habit for Jesus, to seek that time alone and to find that place. In fact, I can picture him as he entered a village looking for, on his way in, those quiet places, those solitary places, marking them in his mind so he could return there early in the morning before anyone else was even up. Silence and solitude was vital to him. He looked for them. He planned for them. He longed for them. But you know, they're not just going to happen on their own. Wayne Oates wrote an insightful book entitled Nurturing Silence in a Noisy Heart. And he describes the task we face this way. Silence is something you hunt for. The decision to listen, to focus attention, to concentrate, goes a long way towards silencing the many other contenders for attention. And so there's time, there's movement, there's place, and then finally another tool that Jesus used was purpose. And his purpose was to pray to the Father. And so he slips away to pray. Now, this story of prayer is one of only 3 stories of prayer in the entire Gospel of Mark. And I find it curious that Mark only tells us about these 3 prayers when I know Jesus prayed lots of times. And so when I took a closer look at why Mark was doing this, it became clear to me that all 3 of the prayers highlighted in Mark are moments of decision. They are turning points for Jesus in his ministry. This is the first turning point. And here in Mark 1, after he finds that solitary place to pray, the text says, "Let's go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. This is why I have come." You see, Jesus was very popular in Galilee, and he faced the temptation just to stay there. But instead, using his habit of prayer, he made the decision to continue his mission. His second turning point was his refusal to lead 5,000 patriots when they came to make him king. Mark and all the gospel writers tell this story, but the Gospel of John is the one that tells us why the 5,000 came. He says the soldiers came to make him king by force. We want you to be our political Messiah. And so how does Jesus manage it? Well, he dismisses the disciples. He feeds and dismisses the 5,000, and then he goes up on the mountainside to pray to God. He needed to stop. He needed to reconnect. He needed to pray. And then the final turning point for Jesus, it took place, as we all know, in the Garden of Gethsemane, shortly before he was arrested. And he prays to God. He says, "Everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." How many wills do you hear there? I hear 2, my will and your will. And Jesus is choosing God's will over his own. And in prayer, he makes the decision of his life that took his life and that gave us life. Turning points, difficult decisions. And Jesus made these having found solitary places to pray. Time, movement, place, and purpose. Spiritual tools that Jesus used, and they can help us to begin. I want to thank you for being a part of this class and this story today. In weeks to come, other topics that we'll explore are some of these: entering, choosing, quieting, addressing, listening, reading, learning, reflecting, writing, starting, and then taking retreats. And we hope that it will enrich your faith and deepen your walk with God. God bless you all.